Hello, I'm George Connolly, and I welcome you to the premiere presentation of Economics 101 on the Free Market Network. In this segment, we will begin an examination of the basic underlying principles of economics and how they apply to a current application of one of the theories ideologically associated with the controversial political debate. It is important to first understand that economics is a science, and largely theoretical. The work of Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of Nations, and his contemporary, Adam Ferguson, were well-founded in empirical observation. Unfortunately, like many other scientific findings, which insist on such empirical observation for validation of the theory, economic theory is often given credibility through purely rhetorical argument when applied to political debate. I refer here to the belief that reductions in taxes will stimulate some desired economic result. Observation of the effect of such fiscal policy invalidates the efficacy of this theory, due to two variables. The first and most important of these variables is the human factor, people. People are not always predictable, and will act according to individual perceptions and expectations of outcomes. The other variable are the economic circumstances at the time of implementation of the policy. Often termed trickle-down economics, a term that is attributed to humorist Will Rogers, who said during the Great Depression that money was all appropriated for the top in hopes that it would trickle down to the needy. The theory we will examine is that tax breaks for the wealthy will stimulate economic growth, and ultimately benefit the entire economy by creating jobs, among other benefits. Though application of the theory is most often attributed first to Ronald Reagan, we would first examine two earlier failed attempts at a Keynesian solution to produce divergent economic effects during Richard Nixon's presidency, which demonstrate the uncertainty of the human factor. The first of these in 1970, for the 1969 tax year, provided a 10% tax refund in hopes of stimulating spending in a stagnating economy. Albeit that the economy improved marginally, it was not due to increased spending. The tax rebate was largely placed into savings, which increased the money supply available to be loaned. Demand for the money soon depleted the surplus, however, and the effect that the rebate had prompted the Nixon administration to again offer the rebate in 1971 to further stimulate savings. True, only to their unpredictable natures, consumers largely spent it. Despite some appearance of effectiveness, the net effect when tax policy was again manipulated by the Reagan administration in the 1980s was to send the economy into a downward spiral as the deficits expanded and national debt mounted. Reagan's successor, George Herbert Walker Bush, would ultimately pay the price after the economic downturn of the late 1980s led to public dissatisfaction with his performance. Albeit the economy had begun to recover by the 1992 election due to increases in the marginal tax rate, the catchphrase, "It's the economy, stupid," largely defined the reason for William Jefferson Clinton's victory. What we term the Bush-era tax cuts were subject to the same folly of all such measures, but due in part to quite another factor of human unpredictability. They were largely supply-side targeted cuts intended to spur business investment in capital with a corresponding increase in consumer spending. Consumerism had become so entrenched in the economy that private debt had mounted to an astronomical level, and consumers largely used the windfall tax reductions to begin to reduce their debt, or place the funds into savings. At the same time, the globalization of commerce, which had begun in the 1990s, began spiraling upward. Largely due to the scale of growth in information technologies, and coupled with disdain for revenue measures traditionally used to discourage importation. Businesses, primarily large corporations, began outsourcing jobs. This was largely done to take advantage of the pool of cheap labor in third world and developing nations, but also had the advantage of reducing overhead related to payment into government unemployment insurance programs and Social Security. These measures were taken by corporations solely for the profit motive. In addition to the savings just mentioned, the rationale was that outsourced jobs would result in increases in the economic well-being of the nations to which the jobs were outsourced, thus creating consumers who would buy the products produced by the corporations, which then added to the wealth of the United States. Albeit this is irrefutable, the reality of the benefit to the nation as a whole is questionable. The rhetorical analogy for the benefit to the United States had been that a rising tide lifts all ships. Were they all in the same harbor, perhaps, but the reality is that a rising tide on the Pacific Rim must necessarily lower the tide elsewhere. While outsourced jobs and tax policies were depleting revenues available to government, the United States also engaged in two very costly foreign wars, and budget deficits began mounting at a phenomenal rate, requiring expansion of the national debt to unprecedented levels. At the same time, government deregulation of financial institutions created what could be termed a perfect storm that would sink the economy as surely as though it were a ship in a raging sea. The details of the subsequent economic collapse is beyond the scope of this program, and largely known to the viewer. We shall therefore focus the ongoing economic debate related to divergent fiscal policy. The general consensus among economists is that the Keynesian stimulus measures of President Barack Hussein Obama were inadequate for the scope of the economic disaster at hand, to which may be added that they came with inadequate controls to assure they were appropriately applied. Further exacerbating the growth of the national debt is the insistence on extending supply-side economic policy at a time when unemployment and uncertainty are denying revenue sources to government and the income needed for consumerism to thrive. A new paradigm in personal finances has also emerged, which may effectively bring an end to consumerism as we know it. The public sector is using their tax windfall to pay down their debt, instead of spending it to stimulate the necessary demand to encourage job creation. The slow rate of recovery is directly attributable to this cyclical phenomenon. Moreover, the affluent, albeit their engagement with consumerism is hardly abated, are investing their windfall, and not increasing their consumption. Hence, the rhetorical argument that taxing the job creators will kill jobs or somehow prevent them from investing when the opportunity arises is as though the advocates of capitalism were denying that the sole motive for engaging in capitalist enterprise were not enough. The notion is, for lack of a better word, hogwash. Supply-side economics is not entirely without merit. Given circumstances under which it would be effective, a predisposition to greater concern for all on the part of capitalists, the wealth of the nation as it were, and private sector participation in keeping with the intent of the policy, it could work. It has however failed each time it was employed, and currently cannot be effective. Thank you for tuning in. I hope this program has been enlightening, and that you will join us again on the next program, when we will examine the truth behind Adam Smith's advocacy for laissez-faire economic policy.